Central Florida Salute YouTube. I'm your host, Bob Peters, and I have a really special guest that I just met the other day. In fact, I met you today. And I heard about him, but I just met him today, and I'm blown away about what you've done. And we're going to get into that.
Okay.
But their name is Daniel Martinez, and you're from Hawaii.
Originally, I was from Los Angeles, grew up in a place called Torrance, California. My dad worked for TRW. He's part of the space program, and he had a little thing that the Russians never liked. It was called Spy in the Sky, and he was part of that program. And they used to fly over, and when they got near Hawaii, a parachute come down, and a C-130 would catch it. And so that's before they had all of the digital. And so my dad was part of that program, and then he was part of the space race to the moon.
Wow. So I gather, because what I should tell everybody, you're retired from Pearl Harbor historian. Proper title. What is the proper title?
42 years of service with the National Park Service. I started off my career at a place called Little Bighorn when I was an undergrad. And I fell in love with the Park Service. And once you fall in love with the Park Service, there's no cure. The only cure is you do the duty. And so as a government official and being an interpreter at Little Bighorn, the scope of that history opened new avenues about, how Native Americans interpreted that site, what it meant to them, what it meant to the American public. The myths and distortions that was a challenge for us, and it was a fun one to say, no, that never really happened. This is what happened.
Yeah.
And when I lived on the battlefield, we had lodging there at the park site, and we'd go in the late afternoon, and we would go to this one hillside and look down on the battlefield, and it was at sunset when that happened. You could feel that place. You could feel it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a little envious of all the history you've seen or been part of. I'm a history buff myself.
Yeah.
Nothing compared to you, so you started with the Park Service. Is that where all this came into, where I want to do history?
I'll tell you a story.
Okay, I'm listening.
This is my dad. Working for the space industry they were centering at the Goddard Space Center in Washington. So we were living in Washington, D.C., and I went to Catholic school before that, and now I was going to public school. Oh, liberation. So I was there. They had girls there, and the whole thing. And so my dad took me to Gettysburg. And it's a little emotional because unbeknownst to me, that trip to Gettysburg would be the beginning of that career that I didn't even know was ahead of me. So we drive up, we go to the site, a park ranger comes out and gives an introductory talk about the Battle of Gettysburg. And then he disappears. And he said, "I'll be right back." So we're waiting for a few minutes. He comes out. He's dressed in a Civil War uniform, Union infantry. And he's got a musket. He's coming out. And he tells us how you load this thing. And he fires it. And I thought to myself for a moment, that's it.
What do you mean that's it?
That's what I want to do.
Oh, okay.
So that's what I wanted to do. I didn't know how I was going to get there, but I was going to get there. And when I was enthralled with going to the battlefield at Little Bighorn, because I really became very interested in reading and collecting books. And I said, I want to be one of those guys, park rangers. And so I talked to the superintendent. He said, well, it's a pretty tough selection, but I'll look at yours, see how you do and everything. So I was an undergrad at college. At the time I was going to California State University at Dominguez Hills, later get my degree there and all of that. And I got chosen out of about 60 applicants. And that became my career with the National Park Service. And now I was part of that history. Because I was researching, I was talking to Native Americans about their, remembrances of it and interviewing them about what it meant to them. And it gave this whole different perspective that was primarily mine, and now they were sharing theirs.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that, because I did an interview with a young veteran, Afghanistan veteran, and he was talking pretty much like you are. You know, it's a different world out there, and you get an education, and I'm sure you got one terrific education with all the things you've done and everything you've done with Pearl Harbor. And, you know, and I know you're doing a program tomorrow at the Plantation, which we're going to put on the end of this show, because I'm really looking forward to it. I saw you talking a little bit about it at the Plantation, getting ready with the sound system, and I have done some history, but nothing compared to what you've done. But when I watched you there with that seaplane, I saw the seaplane there, and I thought about the guy that I interviewed.
That was there.
It was there, and how they have a ship that would blow fog, make fog, so it wouldn't be seen.
Yeah, it was, you know, naval aviation on Ford Island was central to Pearl Harbor, and those airplanes were the eyes of the fleet. And so they're always been, you know, underreported by view. But the guys that did that, they did it throughout the whole war. And then they made this Black Hat Squadron that was night fighters. Talk about scary. But they did that. I think that one of the things that I was so lucky to be part of is I did over probably 300 oral histories of Pearl Harbor survivors. And we would go to their convention. The best one we went to was in Las Vegas. They were all in Las Vegas, and they were in one central hotel, and we recorded. We took 2 crews from Hawaii. We had 2 oral historians, myself and another, and then we had a backup historian as well because we got tired. But for that weekend, we were doing almost 20 hours a day of interviews for that whole weekend, and we collected this great group of interviews, and one of them was of an African American that was on the USS Utah. You know, these are untold stories, and so he told us a story about being on that, and it was just eye-opening as to what their training was like, how segregation in the Navy was, and the military services was, that's the way it was then. It would never be the same after World War II, but it was like that. And so there was a program that's recently been on TV, and it was called Erased, and it's right now. And I was flown to New York. I met with that family that I had done the interviews, and we had sent a copy of that interview to them. They didn't know that story, the grandsons and granddaughters, but now it was on Erased, and we were able to talk about what happened to African Americans at Pearl Harbor. Of course, the boxer from the USS West Virginia, you know, that's always been a big story. And he was from Waco, Texas. I met their family. I went to Waco. And although he was lost on a ship that sank during the war, Liscum Bay was the name of the ship, and I met with the family, and there's a cemetery that's named after him. Well, he went down with a ship, so I drove in there, and there was a African-American fella, and he was cutting all of these graves around there, and I said, can you tell me why this is named that? Because he went down with the ship. He said, well, the family lived right over there, kind of very humble housing. And I said, and they brought his headstone, the military, the Navy, had a headstone, and they brought the headstone and then brought it here to Waco, Texas. And I says, well, where is it? He says, it's right there. So I go around.
You know,
there it is. And so I got a relationship with him. And I said, sir, what is the cemetery? He says, oh, this is segregated cemetery. I says, you're kidding. He said, no, this goes back to the 1930s. And I said, well, it's in kind of a rough state. He says, yeah, I'm restoring it. I bought it. So he was a very wealthy businessman, and he decided, I'm going to honor these guys. There was probably, I counted and photographed them, well over 300 veterans buried there. You should go there.
You know, there's a lot of places I'd like to go, you know. I have done 5 shows in Europe, you know, where Patton's buried and Rommel and all that. And I went to Eagle's Nest and all that. That's all on my YouTube. I have not had the pleasure to do as much as you've done, but I have done Pearl Harbor survivor, Iwo Jima, somebody that was at Iwo Jima, and a Tuskegee Airman.
Yeah.
And
that's special.
Listening, you know, you talk about how they were treated.
Yeah.
And he was telling me all about how he was treated.
Yeah.
And then at the end of it, you know, he says, I found out later not all white men are bad guys. I said, thanks, Dan.
Yeah. Well, they ran into that. There was some.
Oh, it was terrible.
But there was others that were very sympathetic and understood that, you know, when I talked to the guy that was on the Utah, he said, you know, there's 2 of us that were on there and we were treated like regular crew. And he said, and the thing is, and it's erased, he doesn't get out of that ship unless the white guy pushes him out. And he never knew who it was. But he pushed him out the porthole, and he made it.
Wow. You know, I don't want to get too much into what your presentation is tomorrow, because I don't really know how much you're going to talk about Pearl Harbor.
Oh, we're going to do the attack.
This is December 5th.
Yeah.
And, of course, everybody knows Pearl Harbor is December 7th.
Right.
You know, a day that will live in infamy.
Yeah, the Japanese would be exactly 400 miles out from Hawaii at that time, on the 5th.
Yeah, well, a lot of people don't know that we declared war on Japan, but Germany and Italy declared war on us.
Yeah, well, you know, the thing that brought the war to a head was that the Japanese had signed part of the tripartite agreement. That meant that they were part of the Axis powers.
The Axis of evil.
And the White House and Congress was well aware that now linked them to the Nazis of Germany and the fascists of Italy. And there was only one road they were going to take. And so the idea, though, that the Japanese were now joining them, they understood that. But the idea that the Japanese would have the audacity to bring their fleet within 200 miles of Oahu and wax every air station and air base in Hawaii for the outbreak of the war to cripple us, and the Pacific Fleet, was beyond imagination. But not all of them believed that. And in particular, in intelligence, there was down in a basement of the headquarters building, there were guys working on breaking the Japanese code. I met one of those guys early in, I guess people say, hey, Dan, how'd you get involved with this? I had a pharmacist I worked for, and I got a book on Midway that was written by Walter Lord, and it was called Incredible Victory. And I read it and I loved it, and I gave it to him because he was an old Navy captain, and he's on a scow called the Molyneux, and the thing was like Mr. Roberts. It was that story because the fleet's going this way, he's going that way, and he never hardly sees the war at all. But he was a great guy, and he went to pharmacy school after the war with his GI Bill, and became a pharmacist from USC. And so I went to work for him. I was going to Catholic school in Torrance, California, and a friend of mine said, hey, there's a job available if you want to be a stock boy. And I said, yeah, that's great. So I got a job. We got on, and when I found out he was a captain, he shared with me those stories. Other than my father's stories, this was a World War II guy, Navy, that was sharing his stories. And I gave him that book. And he just loved it. He didn't know about the code breaking. He didn't know all that stuff.
Oh, no.
And so he said, we got to find that guy. And I said, pardon me? We got to find the guy that broke the code. And I says, so he hires a detective to find out where this guy is. And I'm losing it as the name. But anyway, he found him. And he says, Dan, I'm going to invite you to the dinner. We're having a special dinner for him down at the pier in Redondo Beach, and we've got a private room, and he's going to tell us his story. And so I went to it in this darkened room, and they're sitting up in the dais, and it's a little setup, and he starts telling us how they broke the Japanese code. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And so I had a book, and he signed it. And then I later did more work about who he was. And there was a picture taken of him before the war. Life magazine came out to do a coverage on the Pacific Fleet in color. It was the first really use of color. And in one of the pictures, there he is.
Yeah. Small world, huh?
Small world. So he will also be in the Yamamoto mission. They'll break the code for that, and that's when our P-38s will jump Yamamoto and kill him on his flight into one of the islands in the Pacific. But you know, being in that room, I was a goner after that. It was the Pacific War and these veterans that I wanted to.
I share that, because when I'm sitting there, you know, I have not done anywhere near what you've done. But when I'm sitting there with like Bill Cumba, you know, who Pelu in Okinawa,
right.
And he did a documentary, Once We're Enemies, where he goes back to Pelu with an Army fella and two Japanese. One of them was the last one out of the cave.
Right.
The other one was the brother of the guy who was in charge of the Japanese soldiers and committed harikiri in the cave. We got to meet him, and you hear these stories of, you know, not stories of real life, what goes on, and you sit there. I'm like you. I sit there in awe of these people. Bill Cumba, 3 Purple Hearts. They want to give him a 4th one. He says, I wasn't wounded enough. Well, what a guy.
Going to the islands that I did from, you know, I went to Wake Island. I went back with the Wake Island survivors, their first trip back to Wake Island, and they didn't go to sleep. The whole time we were there, we spent 2 days there. And we had oral historians. I was with the film crew, and we're doing their interviews. And they just didn't go to sleep. And they said that they never got over the experience of Wake Island. Remember, they're survivors. They saw a lot of their friends die, and then some were executed later on that island. But they also, that prisoner of war experience, they said all of the things that you it was unimaginable, the treatment. And so they went back on Hawaiian Airlines, and I went with them, and we conducted.
How did you hook up with all this through the
Well, I was on the pipeline because I was the.
You had some connections, my friend.
I was the historian for the National Park Service at the USS Arizona Memorial, now Pearl Harbor National Memorial, and we would get these tip-offs that these veterans had come to visit the memorial first. And so, being the person that I am, I said, "Hey, what are these guys up to?" And I got to meet these guys, and then they invited me to go along. Wow. And so we flew Hawaiian Airlines out there, and listen to this. So we land. Taxi down the famed runway, and they're looking out the windows, and they meet and they say, who's going to be the first off? And so the senior officer that was there, who was a Marine, his name was Poindexter, and he was the one that waded into the water and was throwing hand grenades into the Japanese landing craft. And they said there was this one kid, he probably was only 17 or 16, who was in the Marine Corps. And they had a kind of a little name, and he was there handing the hand grenades to the guy. And they said that he was so scared, he was just shaking, but he was getting the hand grenades to them. Yeah. And so, for those days, and when we recorded, and they took us to this place, and I remember there was a small estuary that went into Wake, a water estuary, and these guys are sitting there, this is where our machine gun nest was. And he says, and we didn't want what they call the Japs to get our brass, so we dumped it in right over there. And there were some Marines with us, active duty Marines. They get stripped of their shorts, poosh, poosh, they go into the water. They're pulling up the rounds. I've got one of those. And so it was, this history was just unfolding, and the Marines were so happy because they got all of those to take back as souvenirs, but they had remembered they dumped the rounds in there so the Japanese wouldn't get them.
I'm jealous. I mean, I love history, and I've done some, but nothing compared to what you've done. And well, I'm jealous of everything you've done.
One of my supervisors said, Dan, you've got to do some great stuff, and we've been able to see some really something with these veterans. We're in the Lucky Bastard Club.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I will say this about, I live down here in Lake County in the plantation where you're putting this presentation on tomorrow. But Lake County is full of veterans. We've got all kinds of veterans. And then that's kind of how we thrive, because we get to meet a lot of them here. But to travel all over the world like you did with these people, that had to be something.
Well, I think the thing that I'm doing now with Tim Gray and his production company, he does a number of World War II things you'll see him on. And Tim he'd be a fun interview for you. But Tim, through taking college students to Normandy and to other places of World War II in Europe, we were filming these. We always made a documentary, so it kind of paid for itself, right? And these college students became like, yeah, this is pretty good. And so the professors came up to Tim and said, Tim, this is basically a film school. We should bring film students. And so that's what they did. These college kids now are getting their college credit. They're in Europe. They're watching us and helping us make a documentary film. It's hands-on. And so what I do is...
I was born too soon.
Yeah, I'd like that. So what my job is I do the stand-ups, right? I introduce the film, or I'll be interviewed on part of a historical part of that. And so these students leave this adventure in history and film, and they're getting college credit, and we bring the professors with them. And so this is all paid for by the university, and they have experience. And we took them to one of the places in Normandy that they had never been, and it's down where the British landings were, which were pretty horrific, especially for the Canadians. And they had no idea. They always thought it was the Americans. They didn't understand this Allied effort, and it was eye-opening, because among some of those college students, my mom or my dad's Canadian. They never told me about that.
Yeah. Well, and I've gone to a high school over here when they brought in the traveling wall, one of the traveling walls.
We had that.
I tell this story quite often. And I went there with 5 other Vietnam veterans, and we're talking about the wall. And I said, what you see is a name, what I see is a face, and I share a memory. That's the difference between what you see and we see.
Yeah.
And the kids came back. The first class had to leave, but they came back. And the teacher said, I never had kids come back in a class before to listen to somebody.
Yeah.
But after it was all over, we asked the girl, what do you know about World War II? She says, WWII?
Oh, boy.
She says it was fought in Germany. Yeah. Asked the boy, he said, Adolf Hitler rose to power. He fought in World War I. I says, yeah, that's correct, he did. And because of the sanctions that were put on, he rose to power. And he says, I don't think he was a bad guy. And I said, I did a show with a guy named Gene Klein, a Holocaust survivor.
Right.
You might want to watch that show, kid.
Yeah.
He was not really a good guy.
Well, there is this sense, and you're expressing it right now, of naivete of what really happened. And recently I saw the film Goring, and it's fabulous. And it really gets into the nitty-gritty of what these Nazis were all about. And they get unvarnished in that film. And of course, the actor that plays Goring is, just tremendous. It was one of those films that got to the marrow of that, what it was to be a Nazi. And so I've been to most of the death camps that were there. And, when you go in and you see suitcases stacked to the ceiling, hair stacked to the ceiling, eyeglasses stacked to the ceiling, and know that those that were political prisoners, or even those that were religious, in some cases, not only Jewish rabbis, but Catholics or certain Protestants or Jehovah's Witnesses, they were part of the enemy of the state.
Yeah.
And so, I think today, not to get political, but today there are some lessons of World War II history that really needs to be reviewed, especially by young people, that we don't repeat the mistakes that were made in assessing the threat of Hitler and Mussolini and Hideki Tojo. Those things are the lessons of history that should never be repeated. and should be remembered. And so when I saw this film, and it took me to when I went to the Eagle's Nest as well, and you go to the places where these patriarchs had these like beautiful homes, lovely children, and at the same time they're slaughtering, the Russians on their front. They're dealing with the eradication of the Jewish problem, also for Jehovah's Witnesses and certain Catholics. They were all trying to cleanse their Nazi regime.
Yeah.
And in doing so, they left a stain upon this world we'll never forget.
Yeah, you know what? There's a statue in the harbor that kind of says it all right.
Mm-hmm. It sure does.
The only real Americans are Indians, American Indians,
Yeah.
We were all. But did you go to Dachau?
Yes.
And I did a video there.
Oh,
it's just me and my brother. You know what I mean? We're not.
Yeah.
I'm not in your league, brother. But my brother and I, and you go there, and that's where they tell you you're going to take a shower. You're going to take a shower, and of course they gas you. Then the next room is where the ovens.
Yeah, that's what.
But I didn't realize, and the guy says, we come around the back, he says, that's the Bloody River.
Yeah.
Did you know that?
Yeah.
They used to take the Russian soldiers that captured.
Execute them.
And target practice.
Yeah. And
man's inhumanity, it's amazing.
And when I went there, I'm a bit of a photographer, so I said, how do I capture this thing? And so I was on it's an expansive area there. And so I went out and I saw this kind of interesting shaped memorial. Went to it, and it was like large like this and went up, and it was oval, and it was very, very reverent. But in the center was a skylight, and in it was a Jewish star. And so when I photographed that, it was a moment where the weight of what occurred there.
It really came through.
It was in that image.
Yeah, I can understand that. But
going to Dachau, which was basically at first political prisoners. Think about that. If you're a political party I don't agree with, you're out of here.
Yep.
And so that kind of we have our difficulties ourselves, but we're not exterminating each other. But the lessons of history are need to be repeated. World War II is a reflective mirror of what we can be like.
Yeah, hopefully never.
But at the same time, what we shouldn't be.
Absolutely, I agree with you. But anyway, let's get back to, you got the job. How many years were you with the, I want to go to Pearl Harbor someday. I really do. Because I've heard, and I don't know, Pearl Harbor's survivor, when he passes, if he has his ashes, they go under the water and put it in the ship.
Partially true. The only ones, and all of them have passed now, but the only ones that we don't do, not because that, only those that served on the USS Arizona are allowed to be interred in the ship. I was the interment officer for a long time. I never could believe that I had that honor and privilege. Of course, the superintendent plays a very, very important role in all of that, and we work for him or her. But the idea that we are returning these souls back to their shipmates, think about that.
Yeah.
And so part of my job, too, was going to the National Archives, and we scanned every record of every casualty aboard the Arizona. We have their pictures, we have their enlistment forms, all of that. So why just them? Well, because the center of that is the USS Arizona Memorial. and other casualties. We have a list of all the casualties from all the ships in the Remembrance Circle. And we work very hard with the Navy, because the Navy is our partner there and still is. And so that intertwining of making sure that not only the Navy, but remember, the Army was affected. The Army Air Corps was affected. The Marine Corps was affected. And so all of the sites where Americans died on that day are on the Circle of Remembrance, and their names. And also the civilians, which were well over 68 civilians that died, and many of them children that were killed by friendly fire. And that, the great shadow that goes over Pearl Harbor, people can go there and without seeing that and wondering what are these children in their ages, and some of them are Japanese. Well, they were Japanese Americans, and they were killed mostly not purposefully. They were killed by friendly fire. So as the ships were firing at the enemy above, in the excitement, they were infusing the shells, and what goes up came down all over Honolulu. That's why when I initially got there, these local people were telling me, oh, we got bombed by them. And then I said, I don't know. See, my mother was there. My grandfather was at Red Hill, right above Pearl Harbor that day. And he later would film part of that. And so, but he was up there when the attack. He had come down to the naval base because there's a change of the shift, and what they were doing is underground storage tanks in the mountains above that went 20-story deep and almost 100 yards wide.
Wow.
And so that was the fuel that they could then pump down to the ships, and they were protected from any attack. And so he was doing that, and he was at the change of the shift, very close to Building 150. He was over near the ball field, he said. And these planes came over, and he thought it was a maneuver, because there was a lot of maneuvers going on.
Yeah, right.
And then his friend looked up and he said, I think that's Japanese, because they could see the Hinamaro. And these planes were flying above them about no more than 150 feet. And so they were headed towards Battleship Row. And my grandfather remembers that when he saw the water geyser going, over 100 feet in the air, he turned to his friend and he says, this is a war.
Oh, yeah.
And so there was a suspension of belief that what was happening throughout the naval base. Can you imagine that the Arizona was prepping for church services? And so, when I did a documentary, my very first one for Discovery, we were the first to use the automation. So I'm standing on the mooring quay where the ship's tied up to, the white mooring quays. They put me up there, got the camera on it, and I said, the time is 7:55. The Arizona is preparing for church services and men going ashore on Liberty. And then he says, but unbeknownst to them, they only have less than 15 minutes to live.
Wow.
And so that was like that was that opener, and that's when I did an opener. And then when that was finished, when you see it, the ship appears behind me.
We're going to, before we wrap this thing up, we're going to talk about if somebody wants to see this, where do they go? Okay, because I want people to see what you've done, a lot of what you've done.
Okay.
I did hear, and I got a question.
It's not true.
No. Well, here's a question.
What's that?
Who's the best looking guy you know of, and why am I? Never mind. I'll answer that myself.
Well, I heard their rave reviews.
Yeah. No, I read somewhere, it's Air Force,
right.
And I've flown on a couple of B-17s.
Oh, yeah, I got a chance.
The Flying Fortress, oh, yeah.
It's nice.
But there was two of them flying around when the Pearl Harbor was attacked. But they were unarmed. There was a new kind of plane and everything, I've heard. Do you know about that?
Oh, sure. What happened was they left from an airfield that's beyond me, but I've been to it. There was an airfield that was just north of San Francisco, and these B-17s were loaded up with fuel and their crews. Their first stop was going to be Hawaii, and they were going to hop across the Pacific to the Philippines to bolster the defenses for MacArthur. This is pre-war. So they leave that evening of December I think they leave for the most part because they're flying across on the 5th, and they're flying across, and it's like when you fly to Hawaii, there's nowhere to land.
No.
So you got to make it.
Yeah.
And so these B-17s, which was I think about 6 of them, they were, because one engine failed, he had to go back to the airfield, and so they were due to land at Hickam Field around 8 o'clock that morning, and so they were on the approach and coming in along the coastline, passing Diamond Head and headed towards Pearl Harbor, because the Hickam Field is right next to Pearl Harbor. And they began to go down to make their turn near my house, which is called Makakilo. It's in the west Oahu area. They turned that way just as the Japanese planes were coming in to attack Eva Marine Corps Air Station. And they jumped them. Fortunately, one of the guys knew he was going to Hawaii, so he had his camera with him and the whole thing, and he took pictures, still pictures of that. And so the pictures, I'll send them to you so you can see them.
I want to see them.
They're, the actual camera and the original film is at in Fredericksburg at the Pacific War Museum. They have the camera and all of that. But the guy landed, he also took pictures of Hickam burning and all the planes burning and stuff. And so I got to meet him. I helped do an oral history interview of him. And he said, he couldn't believe it. He had one of the Japanese planes and he took a picture. It was right off his wing. And so he just went over to the B-17 has that opening. It's a little different in those days.
But the B-17 wasn't armed, right?
No.
There was no weapons on there, so they couldn't really do anything.
No, they thought they were, the planes they saw coming up and lining up on either side of them, they thought they were part of the Army Air Force greeting them that they had made it to Hawaii.
Yeah.
They were being greeted by the Japanese.
Yeah, not really.
Yeah. So I interviewed, a number of the Japanese aviators, which part of our collection, and did it through translation and everything. It became evident as the years passed and as we moved towards the larger anniversaries, like the 25th and eventually the 50th, that reconciliation between the Japanese and the American veterans was something on both of their minds. First of all, most Americans and most of the vets of that period had no idea what the Japanese military was really like. They didn't understand how they were trained. They didn't understand how they got in the military. They didn't understand, how the Japanese pilots were so well trained and that they could drop a torpedo at altitude of 40 feet. Well, this is before the kamikaze. So before all of that, which is in the later part of World War II in the Pacific, these pilots were the best of the best. The Japanese, just like the American carrier aviators, it was easy to wash out. You had to be very, very good. And I had a friend that, it became mine that was a fighter pilot in a Wildcat, and he was on the Enterprise, and we were so damn lucky that day. The Enterprise was due to pull into Pearl Harbor at 8 o'clock that morning, but they ran into a big storm coming back from Wake Island, or there'd be the USS Enterprise Memorial.
Yeah, didn't one ship get out? One did get out, right?
Yeah, one of the cruisers got out. Some of the destroyers got out.
Some of them, the Arizona, how many people were inside there when it died?
1,177.
Inside the ship.
Well, they were on the tops. They were at their duty stations.
Because I've seen things where they're banging on the ship trying to get out, and it's really sad. The
part that was the saddest, most of the guys in the Arizona, unfortunately, because of Ford magazines, exploded and they were vaporized by the explosion. There were some that survived from the tops, and that's a story in itself. But when the Oklahoma turned over, there was tapping that went on for weeks, and they couldn't get to him. And so one of the guys who was a Marine, who was one of our volunteers, Dick Fisk, he said that he couldn't handle it, and he put cotton in his ears so he couldn't hear him tapping.
Oh, I could understand that. I hate to say it, but I could understand that.
So Dick and his brother was in the Marine Corps, and they were separated. Their detachments are separated because you ship detachments and then the land base, right? And so when they went, Dick was did the invasion at Iwo Jima. And he went in with his company, and he was one of 3 that came out. Survives Pearl Harbor, survives that.
Wow.
And then finds out later that his brother was killed on the beach. So that was something. And then I took, I guess the one thing, maybe this is a good way to end it. I got a notification from the director of the National Park Service to my boss that told me that they wanted me to be part of a group to take a Navajo code talker, Teddy Draper, to accompany him as part of the party was leaving Window Rock, Arizona, and it was his wish to go back to Iwo Jima where he landed and where he became a warrior. And I said, okay, I get it, because of a Little Bighorn. I know what this is all about. So they show up, we take him to the USS Arizona Memorial, we meet him, obviously, at the airport, and he wanted to go there, and he knew of Navajos that were, he says really interesting, it wasn't a lot of Navajos that wanted to be in the Navy, but he got a shot at that, and so he was a Marine, and so he went through his training, and it became evident that code talkers were going to be really valuable.
Oh, yeah.
And so he became one of the code talkers, and so we had orders. We rarely were not like the military. We're kind of, Park Service is like, sort of like the military, but we got orders from the director that we were to to accompany him, and I got chosen as being part of that. And so we went and we flew to Guam, and then we flew on to Iwo Jima. And I think it's a probably good way maybe for me to end my talk, I think, about this, but there was a Navajo leader, and his son was with him. And we went to, he took us to the place where, at the foot of Iwo Jima, the Mount Suribachi, they landed right there, and they were lucky because there's a sheer rock, like a wall that's about 16 feet, and so it was hard to shoot down on them, so they were up against the wall. And so they got in past Suribachi, started to move inland, and they basically, the code talkers use radios because they're going to be able to transmit the Navajo language over it. The cables to hook up the radio didn't make it. And so Teddy had to go back and get them. Well, he made it. And he said, hey, I need these things. And he said, hey, there's a lot of Teddy, there's Japanese over there. They said Japs, is what they said. And he said, well, I got to go get it. And so he ran up there, and sure enough, Japanese were shooting at him. And he stood there, and you won't get this Navajo today. And so later that night, he thought about his experience, and as a warrior, he had to make up a song. He made up his Indian song, Navajo song. When we got there, he took us to the place where he landed. And they went down there, we let them go, and then we were looking around, but they were not that far away. They came back, and he's got an American flag. At the same moment, he broke out and sang.
He started singing. God, that had to be an emotional moment. I can tell it still is, brother.
Yeah.
I can tell it still is. But you know what?
But that war song was it brought home to me what that war and those who fought it were, ordinary men, ordinary women who did their job.
Yeah. we owe them all so much, really. You know, we do live in the greatest country in the world, and it's all because of those men and those women that laid down their lives.
Yeah.
But listen, I know we're running out of time, but I enjoyed this a lot. I can sit and talk to you all day, but my partner's got to get back to work over there. So we have to end this. But people want to know more about you and about some of your experiences, websites. Where do they go?
Well, Amazon Prime is carrying Unsolved History. You can see that. A lot of what, Tim Gray's website, you can go there. You can see his films free. So you can watch all the films. I'm in a lot of those. And I wrote a book with the Naval Institute about my experience. I co-wrote it with a colonel from the Army, and we were part of the team that looked into whether Kimmel and Short, General Short and Admiral Kimmel, should get their stars back. And I was part of a congressional committee, and we wrote a book about that. It was published by the Naval Institute, and I'm working on a book now on Little Bighorn, but aspect of that, and it's there was a very curious incident that took place, and there was this guy named Marcus Reno, and he was one of the wing commanders, and he did a scout. Custer moved down on the Missouri River, headed towards Little Bighorn, and he was the scout to make sure that there were no Indian parties there that could intercept him. The scout was very controversial because he discovered that, they're probably there, and then turned back and reported it, and Custer and there was another general officer there, I'll think of it, Sheridan, was there, and he thought that they might have tipped it off. Well, the Indians, they knew these guys were out there, but it did this controversy, and so I'm going to photograph what that was like. He had 2 Gatling guns with him as well. Wow. And he went over this trail, and he discovered the Indian Trail, and then turned back to the Missouri River area, and then the rest is the March to Valhalla.
I heard, I don't know if it's true, with Custer's last stand. Mm-hmm. He was coming in from one side, and somebody else was coming in from the other side. There was an attack
in the valley.
But they didn't make it.
No.
He went in there without the backup. I don't know, is that true?
It's true. Yeah, it's a little more complicated than that, but it's true, because Marcus Reno was then, when the command united, and Reno was told to attack the village, go down in the valley, and Custer moved on the bluffs and was going to circle around. And the warriors were so strong, and let's say morale was high, and they intercepted Custer and over, nearly 250 guys, or 212, I think it is, won't make it out alive. And so, the years that I was there in understanding those Native Americans and their viewpoint of it, what's told to them over the generations, it's an American tragedy. That when that took place, America was celebrating. It was a great year. It was 1876. It was the anniversary of this year, the birthday of this country. Yeah. And imagine when they got the news of this disaster, how the country felt then.
I'm going to tell you something I heard.
What's that?
And you tell me. I like these old expressions, prettier than a speckled pup underneath a red wagon.
Yeah.
You may have heard that one.
Yeah, right.
Did you ever hear of the one, I'll be there, good Lord willing, and the creek don't rise?
Yeah.
Creek Nation, right? A lot of people don't know that.
Yeah.
See, you and I got a lot in common, but you got a lot more ongoing than I have, but we have a great interest, and maybe someday I'll get out to Pearl Harbor.
Oh, that'd be great.
But I got to get my partner back to work, because I don't really pay her much. We are not for profit, and we count on AMVETS 2006.
Yeah.
They are the ones who are our major sponsor, And we really appreciate the AMVETS.
Well, we have a big, my neighbor, Fran, he is head of the AMVETS out there. And because my father was a veteran, I became part of the AMVETS there. So the AMVETS program in Hawaii is Fran heads it up, and he does a great job. He's really dedicated to all of that, and of course it leads to the other organizations that are there. So and it exposed me to a part of that comradeship. That because being with the National Park Service was like it was a very special experience, and it was, we worked for the government, and we knew we had our duties, and we were to hold these treasures of history or natural history for the American public, and we were soldiers for that. Yeah. And I never, thought that, being at Pearl Harbor where my mother was, she was 10 years old. She had her last hula lesson the day before from Hilo Hattie. And she looked at as a child, at 10 years old, she couldn't recall. She was at Mass, and somebody came in and they said that they're bombing us. And everybody said, who's bombing us? And what was happening, it was friendly fire fired at the Japanese planes was landing all over Honolulu and killing civilians. Wow. So they never were really bombed. But the whole thing is that the most frightening part of the Pearl Harbor experience for most people was the night that fell, that very day. That night was the longest night because they expected an invasion.
Yeah, you would have thought, yeah. Well, Dan.
Yes, sir.
I enjoyed this, really. And I could talk to you for hour after hour, but we're running out of time. But we are going to have part 2 of your presentation. It will be on Central Florida Salute YouTube. And when you get back to Hawaii, you tell those people over there, got to start watching YouTube, Central Florida Salute YouTube. Well, I'll tell people to watch all your shows.
I'll tell Fran Riddell, who's in charge of AMVETS, that we're on the map.
We're on the map.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
I have a lot of respect for the Park Service.
Yeah.
My father was with the CCC. You remember that?
So was my grandfather.
Oh, yeah? Because my father's one leg was shorter than the other, and the military wouldn't take him.
Oh.
So he went and worked at building the bridges and all that stuff all over the country.
Yeah.
I said, well, we got something in common.
Yeah, my grandfather did that. He was at Hoover Dam, and he was at a couple places. He was at the national parks putting the new roads, and then this Morrison Knudsen Company, because my mom's family was from Idaho, Boise, and Morrison Knudsen was there, and that's how they got the ticket to go put the underground storage tanks up in the hills, and that's what brought them to Hawaii.
Yeah, one thing I tell my kids and my grandkids and everything, go to museums.
Yep.
History, you gotta do the history thing, and this has been a very good lesson for me, and I could tell we have to say goodbye.
Yep.
Because
maybe we can do it again.
Yeah, I'd love that. I'd love to do it again, but we got to say goodbye. And I know the Park Service. You can salute. So we're going to join me and say goodbye because my partner's getting nervous over there.
Okay.
So all our veterans out there, active military and their families, we salute you for all you do. Till next time. Today I'm at AMVETS Post 2006, a major sponsor of Central Florida Salute, and I want to introduce to you the commander here, Ronnie Mack. Ronnie, tell us a little bit about AMVETS 2006. Where are you located? And
we are at 500 North Canal Street, Leesburg, Florida. It's right off of 441, between 441 and Main Street on Canal. Can't miss us. And we're a veterans organization, along with, we have an auxiliary, and we have sons of veterans that are related some form or another to a veteran. And we do a lot for a lot of charitable donations and stuff to charities in the area and in the county. And we're a major sponsor to Central Florida Salute. We're proud of it. We're glad to be. You guys do a heck of a job, and and we'll sponsor you as long as I'm here. We're going to sponsor you. So.
Well, I'll tell you what, we do. Sue and I really appreciate it. We're a two-person operation, and what we try to do with education and supporting our veterans community, and you supporting us, is major thing. It's major.
We're glad to do it, Bob. We're glad to do it.
And you have sons here, you have auxiliary here. You've got a website too, if somebody wants to join.
Yep. It's don't punch into www. It's ambets-2006.org, and it'll take you right to our website, Facebook page, and all that's there, and you'll be able to find that. The webmaster, he tries to get the calendar on there every month, anything pertinent. There's a lot of other links on there for veterans to find out where to get help for certain claims and stuff like that. Our webmaster's really into that stuff. That's the guy you ought to be interviewing right there. So,
well, you know what,
he's got
Ronnie?
a lot of stuff.
You have a lot of clout. You tell him to talk to me, and we'll get him on the show. Okay?
I can do that.
All right. But I just want to, on behalf of Sue and myself, we want to thank AMVETS 2006 because you guys are the major players behind us, and we appreciate it.
But we just wish we could do more. We really do.
Thank you.
Thank you. You guys are awesome.